Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the For Food's Sake podcast. As some of you may know, I recently finished a 30-day vegan challenge. The rules, as I'm sure you can guess, were pretty simple. I had to eat a vegan diet for 30 days straight. No exceptions, no dairy, no meat. Basically no food products that derive from animals in any shape or form. Now, if you're not exactly clear on what veganism is and what the vegan diet is all about, I'd suggest you first check out episode 15 on the For Food's Sake podcast, From A to Veganism, where I discussed, together with my good friend Nina Gehman, all about what veganism is, where this movement has come from, and where it might be going. Now, as the name of this episode might make clear to some of you, I have my fair share of problems with the vegan diet and with the veganist movement in general. And this episode is all about discussing some of the problems and contradictions I saw during my 30-day vegan challenge, and why I currently remain a skeptical vegetarian, and why I haven't wholeheartedly embraced the vegan movement and the vegan diet. But before I discuss what I consider some of the shortcomings of the vegan diet, I feel like I should first speak in defense of veganism, actually. And whilst I couldn't help but occasionally poking fun at the vegan diet and some of the vegan memes I saw whilst I was on my 30-day vegan challenge, I honestly think that most criticisms of veganism are completely misdirected and stem more from a confusion, misinformation, and generally from the fact that people are simply not informed on these issues, or perhaps not informed as they could be. So one of the first recurring themes or questions or criticisms I came across whilst on my vegan diet from people that were asking me about why I was doing it and how I was doing it was that they thought it was impossible. That cutting out meat and dairy, especially in the West, essentially reduces your diet to water and lettuce. And whilst this was often in jest and kind of to make fun of the vegan diet, it does point to a deeper problematic that veganism faces in the West and probably around the world. And that problematic is that people don't necessarily know the alternatives and just assume that by cutting out meat and dairy, what you're left with is what usually accompanies meat and dairy, which is usually a small salad, a potato here and there, some tomatoes, cucumber, and lettuce, which most people would point out is hardly sufficient for a balanced and healthy diet and lifestyle. And this is obviously something that can be quite easily debunked. I mean, I don't want to go into details here, but if you do a little bit of research, if you follow any vegan blogger on Instagram, on YouTube, if you look up vegan recipes, you're really, especially if you're living in the West, spoiled for choice for how to replace meat and dairy. And what's perhaps more relevant is that you only really have to expand your dietary radar beyond a modern Western diet to realize that the dominance of meat and dairy is the exception, not the rule, in diets around the world. And especially if you're looking from a historical perspective, diets from all around the world, from all different cultures, were very much plant-based diets. And meat was used sparingly, was used from nose to tail, so the whole animal and the carcass would be used. And meat and dairy, because they were in short supply and because they were often considered a source of wealth and status, were generally just used more sparingly and for special occasions. And so it's only really modern factory farming that makes our abundance of cheap meat and our lopsided, unbalanced meals possible. And so the fact that nowadays you can have a diet or a plate that consists mostly of meat and dairy is just very much a reflection of the industrialization of meat and the enormous ethical, economic, and environmental consequences that come with it. And I think the sooner we understand how ridiculous in economic, ethical, and moral terms factory farming is and the subsidies that underpin it, the better. I mean, you're essentially paying with your tax dollars, your euros, and your yens today to subsidize industries that will kill the planet tomorrow. Just to give you a quick example of how pervasive and ridiculous the use of meat and dairy has become in Western diets, I came across breadsticks during my 30-day vegan challenge that had Iberian pork fat in them. and other ones that had skimmed powdered milk. Now, if someone could explain to me why breadsticks of all things need these ingredients, I'm all ears. But I think it just points to how unnecessary and how much our industry has come to rely on subsidized meat and dairy products. And just a point on dairy in particular, again, if you look beyond Western diets and you take Asian cuisine or certain African cuisine into consideration, you realize that the vast majority of the world population is lactose intolerant, and that dairy isn't necessarily status quo. It's not necessarily what's considered normal everywhere around the world. And so, to cut a long story short, when people, like I said, in jest jokingly say that you can't survive on a vegan diet, especially here in Paris, my response would be that veganism is only difficult in Paris and perhaps elsewhere because we're currently in a system that actively discourages you from pursuing a vegan diet. Not that it's a malicious movement or a conspiracy theory, but there's just very strong incentives to buy subsidized alternatives in the form of meat and dairy. And so one of the things I realized during these 30 days is that veganism in our current economic system is inconvenient only because not enough people are doing it. In other words, we haven't reached the tipping point for veganism, a point at which it's seen not only as socially normal behavior, but as practically feasible on a day-to-day basis. And I'm really convinced that the recipes aren't harder. They just have different ingredients, and one that we as a Western culture or a French culture or whatever you want to call it just aren't as familiar cooking with. And so that just simply means you aren't as likely to find these ingredients in your standard kitchen cupboard. And in response to the critique that vegan recipes and vegan ingredients in particular are just much more expensive than their contemporary alternatives, I'd say that that's probably because meat and dairy, first of all, is heavily subsidized, as I already mentioned, but also because they're being produced on such an unsustainable industrial scale that just makes them currently cheaper. And especially when it comes to meat, if we'd actually be paying the social and environmental cost of meat, if we were to, for example, put a price on carbon, or if we were to tax meat in some efficient way, then I think you'd quickly see a vegan diet being much more feasible. And so what is at least clear to me is that veganism, generally speaking, as an aspirational diet is much less environmentally damaging than standard diets, and a lot more nourishing than the standard Western diet, which consists of a lot of processed foods and fast foods. There are, of course, exceptions, nuances, and gray areas that don't fit into this generalization, but as a golden rule, I'd say that eating a more plant-based diet makes a lot of sense. And if you're a regular listener to this podcast, I hope it's also clear that what I term the meat lover's diet, so a diet that's rich in all sorts of meat and dairy products, should clearly be written off as economically and environmentally unfeasible. All right, so with those disclaimers of veganism out of the way, let's talk about my beef with veganism. So one of the things that bothers me about the vegan movement, and something that I came across repeatedly during my 30-day vegan challenge, both online and offline, is the free pass that all vegetables get, regardless of their environmental impact or potentially some of the ethical, questionable workers' practices that support some of these vegetable industries. And so what I was surprised by was the lack of critical thought, the lack of self-reflection and self-criticism within the vegan movement, a movement that very much prides itself on the concern for environmental and ethical issues. Take the latest craze around avocados, for example. Now, here you've got a case in point in which the latest food fad, the latest health hype can have enormous hidden consequences. So in the state of Michoacan in Mexico, for example, which is arguably the avocado capital of the world, you've got farmers that are illegally deforesting mature pine forests and replacing them with avocado trees. And so what you've got is, because avocados are so lucrative and so in demand in the US and in the West, in Europe, You've got farmers that are chopping down trees, chopping down an ecosystem, and replacing it with avocado trees that they then regularly spray with pesticides and fertilizers. And because these avocado trees, are such water guzzlers, they're also putting an enormous amount of pressure on local water reserves. Now, from the farmer's perspective, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of economic sense to meet this enormous demand for this latest food fad. Of course, from an environmental perspective, you're growing trees where an average avocado takes 280 liters of water to grow. From a human rights perspective, you've also got the fact that drug cartels, such as the Caballeros Templarios, or the Knights Templar, which have infiltrated the avocado sector because they've realized how lucrative this trade is. And of course, that's led to the extortion of local farmers and the destruction of livelihoods. And so by fixating on avocados and by fetishizing them as this latest novelty superfood that we all must have, we're basically fueling an unsustainable appetite that harms local communities, that causes massive drought, and that encourages deforestation. Now, the point here isn't to tell people to stop eating avocados altogether. I'd be the first to admit that I absolutely love avocados. The point also isn't to say that avocados are just as bad as beef for the environment. I think that's a ridiculous comparison to make. Also, I think it's pretty clear that it's not only vegans that are to blame here for the avocado craze. But what I think is a fair point to make is that vegans do help in valorizing farming systems such as these by making them seen as logical alternatives to a diet that contains meat and dairy, and therefore ignoring the many pitfalls and contradictions that some of these alternative farming systems have. Also, and I think this is very important to point out, you'd be mistaken into thinking that these issues are only consigned to far-off places from which we export our exotic foods, such as avocados. Margaret Gray, in her book Labor and the Locavore, The Making of a Comprehensive Food Ethic, which I'd highly recommend you check out, highlights that our recent turn to more organic, wholesome, and responsible food choices, which definitely has a lot of positive implications, seems to ignore the lives and working conditions of farmers, of farm workers, which are often, I think, an afterthought within this movement. And her work focuses on the labor abuses of the hidden workforce in the Hudson Valley, which supplies a lot of New York City's restaurants and farmers. And so what's interesting here is to point out that this isn't necessarily a developing world problem. It's very much in our backyards. A Guardian investigation as well in Europe pointed out that the situation of migrants that are working in the tomato, pepper, cucumber, and courgette farms in Almeria in the south of Spain is equally desperate, very much up to the point where the Red Cross has had to step in to hand out free food for thousands of these migrants that are routinely paid half the minimum wage and that are threatened with deportation if they complain about their working conditions. So here you've got a point in case of even, let's say, your organic tomatoes, which are grown within Europe. And if you're based in Europe, you're thinking that you're very much part of the ethical solution. You're eating a vegan diet. You're not contributing to, animal abuse. You're not contributing to an industrial system you don't agree with. But if you dig a little deeper, you see that there's enormous human rights violations that are associated with growing these organic tomatoes or courgettes or other fruits and vegetables. Again, I think you'd appreciate that this is clearly not uniquely a vegan problem. It's not like vegans are the only people that eat vegetables. But again, it's very much the fact that these issues of social justice are often sidestepped or overlooked. The human problem behind the way we produce fruits and vegetables, the way we consume organic food, superfoods, and other food fads currently are often overlooked. And so I think there needs to be a better appreciation for the fact that the overcapitalization of anything, any fad or any overconsumption of any product, whether vegan or non-vegan, can lead to problems. And that every resource essentially can be exhausted, right? So that's why I don't buy into the whole, if everyone were vegan, we'd save the world argument. And we'll get into this a little later. But I think it's not just idealistic to think this way, but it's simplistic, it's reductionist, it's unrealistic, and it's unhelpful. One quote that I recently came across that sums this up quite nicely by Professor Raj Patel is that when capitalism is involved, the capitalist will take your vegetarianism and make money from it with the same kind of techniques they've honed in meat manufacture. And so I think the point here is that you have to remain self-critical, because the more veganism and vegetarianism becomes popular and becomes mainstream, which, as I hope I've made clear by now, is predominantly a positive phenomenon. So the more that this happens, the more that we have to be self-critical and realize that just like meat and dairy, not all vegetables are created equal. So now let's go back to the argument that by going vegan, we can save the planet. Now, I'm not being hyperbolic here, and I don't mean to sound at all condescending, because I really think this is an issue that we have to address centrally when we talk about veganism, because it's an issue you come across a lot when you're with vegans or when you're on these vegan websites, and that's that by going vegan, not only do you drastically reduce your environmental impact, of course, your impact on animal agriculture by not being part of what is essentially mass slaughter and torture of animals, but also that you can essentially help feed the world, and then by doing so address some of the major issues that we face as a global population today, namely world hunger and climate change. So I thought I'd dedicate a little bit of this podcast just talking briefly about some of the main claims here and why I'm not quite convinced, and perhaps more importantly, why I don't think this campaign of go vegan, save the planet is the right way of going about it and is the right way for veganism to go forward as a movement. Now, one of the most often cited studies by vegans and vegetarians alike, which I myself have quoted in this podcast numerous times, is the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's study on the impact that the livestock industry has on climate change. In summary, the study shows that greenhouse gas emissions associated with the livestock supply chains add up to around 7.1 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, CO2 equivalent per year, which is 14.5% of all human-caused greenhouse gas releases. And so the study talks about how the main sources of emissions that come from the livestock industry that add up to this 14.5% are feed production and processing, the outputs of greenhouse gas emissions because of the digestion of ruminants, namely cows, manure decomposition, and then a small remainder is attributable to the processing and transportation of animal products. If you want more information on the methodology that the FAO used, I'll provide that in the show notes. There is some criticism of the methodology used, notably by Simon Fairley. He's an English author that wrote a book called Meat, a Benign Extravagance, but we'll keep that conversation. We'll go into more details about the controversy there in another episode. What's important to keep in mind for now is that this study, at least from an environmental perspective, is very much the starting point for vegans and vegetarians. It's supported either directly or indirectly by other studies that point to the enormous environmental footprint that meat eaters have. Research published by the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, for instance, looked at the carbon footprint of meat eaters compared to vegetarians and found that meat eaters' diet requires 17 times more land, 14 times more water, and more than 10 times the energy that a vegetarian diet would. The principal reasons being that a large proportion of the world's land for growing crops is actually for crops to feed livestock rather than humans. And of the approximately 5 billion hectares of agricultural land that we have around the world, 68% is used for livestock. And so what we can conclude here, according to a University of Oxford report on food and climate in the journal Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, is that if we were to all go vegan, the world's food-related emissions would drop by 70% by 2050. Now, the same study makes a compelling case for going vegan based on a health perspective. The researchers modeled the health benefits of dietary change and found that by 2050, we could be saving as much as 8.1 million lives, with half of the deaths avoided due to a reduction of red meat consumption and the other half due to a combination of increased fruit and vegetable intake and a reduction in calories, leading to fewer people being overweight and obese. Now, when it comes to global malnutrition and world hunger, we're talking here about around 40 million tons of food are needed globally to eliminate the worst cases of world hunger today. If you compare that to the amount that we're currently using to feed animals on farms, which is 760 million tons, the wider argument goes that it's a matter of reallocating our resources from the animals that we feed to directly feeding human beings. I know I'm simplifying this argument very much, but I'm just trying to paint a bigger picture here of the logic that goes behind the veganist claim that we can save the planet by all going vegan. An argument that I think has a lot of strong claims, but as you'll see, I think also has some weak points. So were we all to go vegan, the ideal scenario that's often described is that we dedicate the majority, say at least 80% of the pasture land that's currently used to feed livestock to the restoration of grasslands and forests, which could capture carbon, alleviate climate change, and also would be a natural boon to biodiversity. The remaining 20 or so percent of former pasture land could then be used to grow more crops that could feed humans directly and fill in a potential future gap that we might have in the food supply. Now, I think my first concern when I look at these statistics and when I look at these studies is that this conversion to a vegan diet would have drastically different consequences on farming practices in different regions around the world. So one thing we have to take into consideration here is that land, whether it's arable, semi-arable, or non-arable land, is not distributed equally across the planet. So let me explain just quickly for those that are not familiar with those terms what the difference is between arable and non-arable land. So arable land is basically land that is capable of being plowed or tilled. It's capable of growing crops. And that's traditionally contrasted with pasturable lands such as heaths, which are lands that might be capable of supporting some grass or shrubs, but that doesn't make it arable. What makes it arable is the fact that it's able to support crops. It's able to support crops such as staple grains, so wheat, maize, and rice. And what makes this distinction so interesting and so important is that non-arable land, which you might, for instance, find in mountainous regions with dry climates, is not suitable for agriculture, but it's land where you can graze cattle, sheep, and goats, which by grazing on what are inedible grasses for humans, they're able to convert these inedible grasses into edible meat and milk. And whilst vegans might quickly turn around here and say that we've got enough arable land to grow all the crops to feed all humans directly, which might very well be true, my rebuttal would be that that arable land is not distributed equally across the world. In fact, around a third of the world's land is composed of land that's only suitable for animal agriculture. So without livestock, life in certain environments just would become impossible for some people. So when you take into consideration nomadic groups such as the Mongols and the Berbers, who, stripped of their livestock, would have to settle permanently in cities or towns, they're likely to lose not only their cultural identity in the process, but it's likely to make them and groups like them completely dependent on another form or system of farming. So if your ultimate goal is to ban the use of livestock because you consider it a form of slavery, a form of animal slavery, what you're actually doing is preventing these remote areas around the world that very much depend on livestock for their daily source of nutrition. What you're advocating for is for them to become completely dependent on an arable land system that's distant and that's perhaps less reliable, and that ultimately, from their perspective, is a lot less efficient use of land. And that leads me naturally onto my next point, which is that in some underdeveloped regions in the world, meat and milk consumption is the only reliable source of protein and fat. So here my point isn't to say that you can't flourish, you can't thrive on a vegan diet. That's a debate I'm not going to get into here. But it's a question of, in certain regions of the world, replacing meat with nutritionally appropriate substitutes, right? So what is clear is that animal products contain a lot of nutrients per calorie, and more so than the vegetarian staples like grains and rice. So it's very much about choosing the right replacement, which exists, but which would be vital, especially for the world's 2 billion plus undernourished people, because going vegetarian here, as Tim Benton, a food specialist from the University of Leeds, has pointed out, going vegetarian globally could create a health crisis in the developing world, because the question would be, where are we going to get these micronutrients from? Again, I'm pointing out here that it's not impossible to get these micronutrients, and it's clear that people thrive on vegetarian and vegan diets. But if we were to, from one day to the next, remove meat and dairy as a source of nutrition for people, especially in underdeveloped regions of the world, the question is, how do we get all these extra nutrients into the food system? How do we replace a livestock system that these people have depended on for centuries? When it comes to world hunger, I think vegans have made a fair ethical point, at least, that it seems very hypocritical to be overfeeding animals around the world when we could be feeding starving humans directly. I think that's a fair point to make from an ethical point of view. I think where the argument again falls short is that when it comes to famine, when it comes to world hunger, I think history has shown that it's not always a question of a lack of food, a lack of the availability of food. It's much more a question of politics and of power politics, and the fact that famine is often used as a tool of political repression or a tool through which corrupt governments are able to achieve certain political results. So my point here is that I'm not convinced that by having a vegan world, we'd necessarily solve the problem of world hunger. I think another fundamental shortcoming of a vegan world would be the fact that we would no longer be able to provide animal manure for fertilizing crops. Now, vegan permaculture advocates would say that green manure, which is where you grow plants in rotation with crops to sequester nitrogen from the atmosphere, provides enough of the nutrients to allow crops to flourish. And while it's true that nutrients don't have to pass through an animal to nourish the earth, there's a very interesting point that Simon Fairley makes when it comes to manure that a vegan alternative world wouldn't be able to provide. So if we were to convert all agriculture around the world to one that relies only on a vegan structure, and if we were to get rid of all animal manure, what that means is that we would need a lot more arable land in order to accommodate the growing of green manure. And that processing of vegetable compost, this new manure, is very labor intensive. And as Simon Fairley points out, it ironically also tends to rely on fossil fuels. And where animals are really unique here is that animals don't create fertility, but they do a great job of transporting and processing it by eating grass on land that wouldn't be easily cultivated, so non-arable land, and then conveniently dropping these nutrients on arable land, so on land that we would use to grow crops. And so this is something, the fact that an animal can transport these nutrients from non-arable land to arable land without using any fossil fuel heavy machines, that is something that Simon Fairley considers an enormous plus. A final point I'd like to make on the prospects of a vegan world, a final critique, is another critique by Simon Fairley, where he talks about a default livestock system. So Simon talks about a bare minimum of meat consumption, where reducing meat consumption any further leads to massively diminished returns, because doing so, he says, means refusing free meat. So let me explain that in a little bit more detail. So a default livestock system is a system which he defines as one that provides meat, dairy, and other animal products, which arise as the integral co-product of an agricultural system dedicated to the provision of sustainable vegetable nourishment. I know that's quite a mouthful, but let me unpack that a little bit. So under such a default livestock system, animals are raised not only for food and food alone, they're raised because their meat, eggs, and dairy are a welcome byproduct of the aid that they provide in farming vegetables. So that's because animals provide labor, they provide, as we mentioned, otherwise inaccessible nutrients into the food chain through manure, and they serve also as a food bank. So it's important to point out here that no dedicated crops are grown for these livestock as they are today in such a system. Their diets consist mainly of waste that we produce. So if you look at, for example, pigs that eat food scraps that would otherwise go to waste, or grass in these non-arable lands. So in such a system, animals are not a burden. They don't require us to produce extra feed for them. Instead, they're very much part of a system, and any surpluses go to animals. And then, vitally also, when we need to as humans, when we're facing a crisis, we still have the ability to kill the animals and make a withdrawal of an investment we made. It might be a very brutal economic way of looking at it, but the reality is, if you are facing a crisis, you still have essentially an insurance policy in a cow or a pig that you can slaughter and eat when times are rough. And so what Simon sees as much more risky, and I'd have to agree, as a vegan policy of full-blown nutritional efficiency where there's very little wiggle room for if crops fail. So a world in which livestock don't exist, in a truly vegan world, which considers livestock as animal slavery. So in a true vegan world, you would have no livestock. You do not have livestock as an insurance policy to fall back on. Now, it's clear that we're talking very hypothetically here. Both Simon Fairley's idealized version of the world of a livestock system that's integrated into a wider permaculture system is very, very distant to where we are now. So, like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, veganism as an aspirational diet makes a lot of sense if we're combating an industrial food system. The point here was very much to mention that the vegan ideal of a vegan world might not necessarily be desirable either. All right. Now, with that out of the way, I'd like to make one final point before I sign off here today. And I think it's a very important point when it comes to veganism and my reasons for not turning towards veganism. And this is a critique about veganism as a movement, not so much the vegan diet per se. But the reason I think it's specifically relevant here is because once you find yourself eating a vegan diet, and bear in mind, I only did this for 30 days, but once you start, you can all too easily find yourself in an echo chamber, both online and offline, with vegans. And so the vegan diet over time becomes more and more synonymous with the vegan movement. I think this is because by engaging with the vegan diet, you're essentially engaging today in a political act. It's an act of boycotting the meat and dairy industry and the industrial system behind it. And so you do naturally, by eating a vegan diet, become part of a movement. And I realized over my 30 days is that the more time you talk about veganism, much more time than you do actually eating vegan food, because people are curious and vegans attract vegans and so on and so forth. So the more time you spend talking about veganism, the more time you spend doubling down on these arguments. And slowly but surely you find yourself finding it harder to tolerate those around you that aren't making the same sacrifices. And so in a kind of sick and twisted way, you find yourself in a more toxic environment because you find yourself making sacrifices that no one else is necessarily making, and it's a frustrating environment to be in. And so this leads me to my final warning when it comes to veganism, which is that the paradoxical political strategy that's used of scorning, ridiculing, and shaming people simply won't work. So whether it's labeling meat eaters as inhuman, indecent, and inconsiderate, whether it's shaming ex-vegans, I think these are tactics that overlook the efforts by many, however small, to eat meat and dairy more sparingly, to eat more locally, to fight their own battles. I think this vegan militant hostility, which is clearly a minority within the vegan movement, but which is present nonetheless, alienates conscious consumers, it alienates concerned vegetarians and other vegans and ex-vegans, and I think it tarnishes the reputation of all plant-focused dietary movements. And ironically, I think this scorn, this ridicule, and this shaming only provides ammo to the real culprits, which are the shameless, remorseless, provocative meat eaters and the wider meat and dairy industry, which, line their pockets with profits and ignore the farmers that they claim to be supporting. And so what I'm particularly interested in is how we can decouple the wider vegan movement from the vegan diet. Like I mentioned, I found it incredibly frustrating spending all my time at lunch and dinner talking about veganism. If I were to become a vegan, I would want it to be one of many of my identities, and surely not the only one. And I would want to stay open to the ideas of people like Simon Fairley, to other diets, whether it's the paleo diet or a flexitarian diet, which predominantly promote a more whole foods-based, non-industrial diet, and to not try and isolate veganism as the movement or the solution to our current food problems, but as one among many movements that support the move away from factory farming and the industrial food system that we currently depend on and that we obviously need to move away from. And so where I see myself moving in the future is towards a diet that's increasingly plant-based, of course. So I've been vegetarian for over 2 years now. I'm also limiting my dairy consumption as much as possible. But at the same time, I'm very wary of falling into those food fad traps we talked about the contradictions within veganism, and of course that I strongly believe that livestock can and perhaps should play a role in agriculture when done right, not in an industrial system, and that it's therefore also my responsibility to support that movement. So there you have it, my take on veganism, the vegan movement, and my 30-day vegan challenge. That's it for now, guys. I'll see you next time.